country does not need a banking panic or a stock market crash to reveal economic collapse. Sometimes collapse arrives as darkness. It arrives when traffic lights fail, factory shifts are cut short, refrigeration breaks down, flights are cancelled, and daily life begins revolving around the question of whether electricity will still be there in an hour. That is why Cuba's power crisis matters. The island's latest nationwide blackout is not just an energy problem. It is a window into how an economy starts losing the ability to function. Reuters and AP both reported that Cuba suffered another island-wide grid failure on March 16, 2026, knocking out power for roughly 10 to 11 million people and marking the third major blackout in 4 months. What makes that especially important is that repeated blackouts change the meaning of the problem. A single outage can be explained away as an accident or a technical fault. Repeated nationwide failures point to something deeper, a system that has become too weak to absorb stress. AP reported that officials described the March 16 failure as a complete disconnection of the national electrical system, while Reuters said the grid operator traced the collapse to a transmission problem and highlighted the recurrence of major outages. When power becomes unreliable, the damage spreads far beyond the grid itself. Factories cannot keep a stable production rhythm. Shops lose refrigeration. Food spoils faster. Hospitals and clinics must shift into emergency mode. Public transportation becomes less reliable. Internet access worsens. Schools and universities cut activity. AP reported that Cuba's broader energy crisis has already disrupted university life, reduced in-person teaching, and contributed to student frustration over deteriorating basic services. In other words, the blackout is not the whole crisis. It is the force multiplier that makes every other weakness worse. That is the first reason blackouts are breaking Cuba's economy. They destroy coordination. Modern economies run on timing. Goods need to move on schedule. Workers need predictable hours. Machines need stable input. Hotels need functioning services. Airports need power. If electricity becomes erratic, productivity falls not only because output drops, but because the entire system becomes harder to synchronize. Even where operations continue, they do so at higher cost, lower efficiency, and with less confidence. A blackout is not just lost energy. It is lost reliability. And Cuba is especially vulnerable to lost reliability because its energy system was already fragile before the latest collapse. Reuters reported that Cuba has gone 3 months without oil shipments under the current squeeze and has received only 2 small fuel shipments this year, one from Mexico and one from Jamaica, with none from Venezuela, historically a crucial supplier. AP reported that the island is now relying on a mix of solar energy, natural gas, and aging thermoelectric plants, while experts warned that the infrastructure suffers from years of underinvestment and lack of maintenance. That is the second reason blackouts are so destructive here. They are hitting a grid that no longer has much margin for error. In a stronger system, one plant failure or one transmission problem is serious but containable. In a weak system, one disruption can cascade through the entire network. AP reported that Cuba's authorities are trying to restore service by restarting thermoelectric units and reconnecting smaller circuits, but restoration remains slow and unstable. That tells you the system is not simply suffering from temporary inconvenience. It is struggling to regain equilibrium after each shock. This also explains why the blackouts are inseparable from the fuel crisis. Cuba's problem is not only that its infrastructure is old, it is that old infrastructure now has to operate under severe input stress. Reuters described the country as facing a severe economic crisis marked by fuel shortages, outages, and medicine scarcity, while AP reported that President Miguel Diaz-Canel acknowledged Cuba has not received oil shipments in more than 3 months. When fuel becomes scarce, power plants cannot run normally. When power plants cannot run normally, outages spread. When outages spread, the economy loses output, services weaken, and public frustration grows. The third reason blackouts are breaking Cuba's economy is that they damage tourism, and tourism is one of the country's most important sources of foreign exchange. Reuters reported in February that Cuba's worsening fuel shortages were choking tourism. forcing airlines such as Air Canada and WestJet to suspend flights and pushing Russian authorities to evacuate tourists and suspend operations because of the jet fuel crisis. Reuters also reported that hotel groups closed or consolidated some properties as conditions deteriorated. This matters because tourism brought in about $1.3 billion in revenue in 2024 and represented roughly 10% of Cuba's export earnings. That makes the power crisis even more dangerous than it first appears. Cuba needs hard currency to import what it cannot produce. Tourism is one of the few major channels through which that hard currency arrives. But tourism depends on fuel, transport, refrigeration, airport operations, hotel reliability, and basic service continuity. So once blackouts and fuel shortages begin affecting flights and hospitality, the economy starts losing not just electricity, but one of the few cash flows that might help stabilize the system. A weaker grid disrupts tourism and domestic operations. Less foreign exchange makes fuel imports harder, and harder fuel imports mean the next blackout becomes more likely. The fourth reason blackouts are breaking Cuba's economy is that they raise the cost of almost everything at once. Even when production does not stop entirely, firms must operate around uncertainty. Hotels need backup generation. Businesses lose inventory. Transport becomes less efficient. Families spend more time adapting to interruption. Hospitals and pharmacies become harder to supply. Reuters reported that shortages now extend to essentials including food and medicine. In an economy already under strain, blackout costs are not limited to the electricity sector. They get embedded in the whole cost structure of society. This is also why blackouts matter more than standard growth numbers suggest. The World Bank's data page shows Cuba's GDP growth at -1.1% in 2024. That already tells us the economy was weak before the latest nationwide outages. But GDP alone does not fully capture the way power failure degrades daily economic capacity. An economy can post weak growth and still remain coordinated. What Cuba is losing now is not just speed. It is functionality. That loss of functionality is what people feel first. They feel it when transport is delayed. They feel it when classes are interrupted. And when enough people feel that at once, the crisis stops being technical. It becomes political and social. AP reported that a protest in Morin, central Cuba, ended with 5 arrests after demonstrators damaged the local Communist Party headquarters and nearby stores, with officials linking the unrest to the worsening energy and food crisis. Reuters likewise described growing public pressure and unrest as shortages deepened. These events matter because public anger in situations like this usually follows system failure, not just ideology. People may tolerate hardship for a long time. They become much less tolerant when the state can no longer deliver electricity, transport, food stability, and basic continuity. Confidence is one of the least visible but most important economic assets any country has. It affects whether workers show up expecting a normal shift, whether businesses plan ahead, whether families spend or hoard, whether tourists book trips, and whether investors believe the country can hold together long enough to justify risk. Repeated blackouts weaken that confidence from the bottom up. They tell everyone that even if the formal institutions remain standing, the basic machinery underneath them is unreliable. And Cuba's crisis is particularly revealing because it shows how an economy can begin to break without a single dramatic market event. There is no need for a Wall Street-style panic, no need for a one-day crash. The breakdown can be slower, more physical, and more visible in ordinary systems. The grid, the airport, the fuel depot, the classroom, the pharmacy, the bus route. That is what makes the Cuban case so useful for understanding fragile economies in general. A weak economy can survive low wages, but once it starts losing electricity, fuel, and foreign exchange at the same time, the crisis stops being cyclical. That is the deeper lesson here. Cuba's blackouts are not just proof of an energy shortage. They are proof that the economy support systems are too exposed, too undermaintained, and too dependent on flows that can no longer be counted on. Reuters and AP both make clear that the island's crisis is now being driven by the overlap of fuel scarcity, aging infrastructure, and repeated grid failure. The result is not just darkness. It is the loss of economic rhythm, because they are shutting down more than electricity. They are weakening productivity. They are draining foreign exchange, and they are exposing the limits of a system that no longer has enough spare capacity to absorb prolonged stress. It is about what happens when an economy begins losing the basic conditions needed to function at all.